The United States is known as a land of the free. The American character is rooted in independence, in thought, belief, and daily life. Yet the foundations of the American character are now under assault by groups that believe in changing not just the surface policies, but to also rewrite the history of this country, present new values to replace its traditions, and to reform even its foundation, the American Constitution. Under the narrative that some forms of speech and belief are dangerous,
Facebook's oversight board has decided to uphold the site's suspension of former President Donald Trump.
there's now a push to regulate speech and suppress belief. Under the narrative that America is too violent, there's a push to eliminate the rights of citizens to own firearms. And there are similar pushes being made to change the fabric of this country, down to a dismantling of its monuments and demonizing of its founding stories. Behind these narratives, however, are socialist movements and political groups that have misrepresented not just the history of this country, but even the very fabric of its system of government. The ideas that this country was founded on are now being warped and maligned to fit social agendas. America is more than just a nation. It represents an idea. And what would it mean for the world if that idea was lost? The American story was once seen as a message for the United States to promote. It was the idea that people, when given freedom, can create a prosperous and harmonious society. It was the shining city on the hill, with its message of freedom being an example for other nations to aspire towards.
And as we pray God, they always will, that another generation of Americans has protected and passed on lovingly this place called America, this shining city on a hill, this government of, by, and for the people.
The American story is now being attacked by groups and powers holding that freedom itself is a danger, and that government should more finely regulate the lives of each person to ensure social harmony. This conflict isn't new, however. It goes back to the time of America's founding, when the age of kings was coming to an end and people around the world were looking for what type of government could replace it, while finding the place of religion and tradition also in that new age. In 1776, the American Founding Fathers established one of these ideas, with a statement in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They established a government based on the idea that people's rights are given to them by God, and that government is only instituted among men to protect these rights. This led to the creation of one of the most prosperous nations in the history of the world, with its foundations in individual freedom. Just several years later, after the American Founding Fathers signed the U.S. Constitution in 1787, a very different system emerged in France, where the Jacobin leaders of the French Revolution established the idea, in 1793, that alongside the destruction of the Age of Kings, that God should also be abandoned. Under the new government, the Committee of Public Safety, they accumulated all power to a central government authority, established a state-run atheist cult of reason, and launched the Reign of Terror, to put to the guillotine all who opposed them. This idea of brutal suppression in the name of the greater good, of eliminating tradition and belief, and of holding a single centralized power of government that could control the lives of each individual, would lead to the ideas of communism and its system of socialism that would eventually sweep the world. And through history leading up until today, these two competing ideas of freedom and socialism have been at the heart of arguments on the role of government and the place of citizens. This has led to many attacks on the American character in attempts to demonize not just our history, but even the founding principles of this country. Yet who are the groups leading this charge against America?
So you have a situation where this Constitution has protected Americans' rights for 200 years. Their right to free speech, to assembly, their right to keep and bear arms, their protection from seizure of their assets, unlawful searches, unreasonable searches. It's given the American people more freedom than anybody has enjoyed in world history, and consequently more prosperity than anybody has enjoyed in American history. But it has stopped tyrants gaining power. And so the Constitution is the enemy of all tyrants. So every tyrant in America right now, from the radical left to the globalists to big tech to the Communist Party of China, are all trying to destroy the US Constitution. Because if they can do that, they have complete power over every aspect of our lives. That's their dream, and that's our nightmare. The left has tried to demonize America. It's tried to propagandize against this country, to create racial division here, to use the fifth column, the communists within this country, to create as many problems as they can.
The New York Times has a new project marking 400 years since the first African slaves were brought here to the U.S.
The 1619 Project, in an attempt to reframe America's history through the lens of slavery.
The New York Times Magazine is launching a series called the 1619 Project.
How is it that America is being attacked? Much of this narrative is coming from a rewriting and falsifying of American history. There's a push now to adopt the framework of the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which even its own fact-checker said contained false claims into American education. There are radicals pushing to tear down statues of America's history, ban books that present history they don't like, and physically attack anyone who espouses the ideas of freedom that they hope to destroy. Many of these people are animated, however, by a false understanding of American history. And one of the main authors who spread this falsified history was communist sympathizer Howard Zinn, author of the 1980 book, People's History of the United States.
Howard Zinn's interpretation goes back to 1913 to Charles Beard, whose theory has been debunked several times over. And Charles Beard had a materialist interpretation of the Constitution. He basically said that it was set up by men of privilege to preserve their material privilege. And Howard Zinn pretended to be uncovering.
Among the many tricks that Howard Zinn used was to take information out of context in order to falsify its meaning. This included, for example, taking the Journal of Christopher Columbus, beginning a quote from one page and using an ellipsis to continue the quote several pages later, completely altering its meaning. Now, the way that they frame the American Constitution and the American system is that, they frame America as this system of slavery, of oppression, rather than the opposite interpretation, which used to be the take on it, that America was a symbol of freedom for the world.
Well, it was, a beacon. I mean, there were very few places where people had rights guaranteed to them, and where there weren't titles of royalty, where people weren't allowed to think of themselves as sort of elevating themselves by their own efforts.
And contrary to the narrative spread these days that America's founding fathers launched the revolution only to preserve their rights to hold slaves, in reality, they fought a near impossible battle against the most powerful empire in the world, with many losing their fortunes and even their lives in the process. Contrary to the falsified stories now being presented, the reason the founding fathers launched the revolution is clearly explained in their notes, and clearly laid out in the Declaration of Independence. It states, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having an indirect object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states." And it lays out 27 grievances committed against the colonial Americans. Among these were trial without jury, burning towns, abdicating the local government, taxing without consent, and transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, among others. But the question remains, if the Founding Fathers believed in freedom, then why did they have slavery?
It's certainly true that in the 18th century, everyone was a racist. We're talking something that's 225 years ago, and obviously if that existed today, we would condemn it. The point about the Constitution isn't that social reality of racism. It's, in fact, the reality that these founders, and not just the men who wrote it, but the families that raised them, their moms, their siblings, the unnamed people in history, ironically even some of their slaves or free people of color, were part of a society that did something very radical, first with the Declaration and then with the Constitution. And that was, say, two things. The first is that government's job is to defend our liberties. Its whole purpose, actually, is to make sure that we have our freedoms. And the second is that whatever government does comes from the consent of the governed. The Constitution was the vehicle by which we could enshrine the rights of those people who had been oppressed. So in fact, those people who believe that America is an imperfect society ought to first accept that the Constitution is the vehicle that allows us to address some of the significant social concerns they've had. What the Constitution got perfect, I would say that very rarely as a historian, was putting two seemingly competing goods, two competing aims in balance. On the one hand, liberty, and on the other hand, order. And what I've told students over the years is we don't want unfettered liberty because it's chaotic. We also don't want just complete order because there's not a lot of freedom. What the Constitution did was put into constitutional governance the ability of our governed and the government to keep those things in balance.
The American idea of freedom and the socialist model of the French Revolution emerged alongside each other on the world stage. It raised the debate around the world where power lies in a society, what the relationship between the government and the governed is, and what rights should be given to the masses. After observing the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, author G.K. Chesterton wrote in G.K.'s Weekly in 1925 that the thing behind Bolshevism and many other modern things is a new doubt. It is not merely a doubt about God, it is rather specially a doubt about man. He adds on these socialists that in short these sages, rightly or wrongly, cannot trust the normal man to rule the home, and most certainly do not want him to rule in the state. The American idea of equality of opportunity is antithetical to the socialist idea of equality of outcome. As many writers noted in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the ideas of equality of outcome, collectivism, and state fraternity are antithetical with the ideas of liberty and freedom. Author Frederick Bastiat noted in his 1850 book, The Law, that regardless of the claims to freedom espoused by socialists, their want for equal outcome would always lead to state slavery. He wrote, "It is not sufficient that it should guarantee to every citizen the free and inoffensive exercise of his faculties, applied to his physical, intellectual, and moral development. It is required to extend well-being, instruction, and morality directly over the nation. This is the fascinating side to socialism. But I repeat, these two missions of law contradict each other. We have to choose between them. A citizen cannot at the same time be free and not free." He adds, "The socialists say since the law organizes justice, why should it not organize labor, instruction, and religion? Why? Because it would not organize labor, instruction, and religion without disorganizing justice. And on the contrary," he states, "cast your eye over the globe. Which are the happiest, the most moral, and the most peaceable nations? Those where the law interferes the least with private activity, where the government is the least." The system of government the Founding Fathers created for the United States has already begun to change. This includes changes to the role of the judiciary, mainly under Franklin D. Roosevelt, who threatened to pack the courts and enhanced the powers of the judicial branch of our government over the rights of the states. Combining the powers of governance in the presidential office with the ability of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution means party interests from the federal government could dictate rights and laws throughout the states. What happens when there's no longer a baseline? no longer a set and unchangeable system of protections for the average citizen. Without an unchanging standard on rights and limits of government power, rights are given or taken in the will of the moment, and the government power can expand according to the will of a tyrant. And now in the United States, as the basic rights of citizens protected by the Constitution's Bill of Rights are being challenged, where are we heading as a society? And if America is changed, what does that mean for the world?
The American Constitution is both a product of this culture of independent thought, of frontiersmen broadly defined. The Constitution mostly is a guarantee of what government cannot do. And then, of course, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution enshrine just a reminder to posterity that government is not the source of our rights. Government's job is to protect those rights. And so if the Constitution either goes away or is further diminished by some radicals on the left, then what the world loses is not just some document, not just something we're teaching in history classes. We lose the single greatest written form of the two most important philosophical achievements in human history since our Creator walked this earth. Historically, I would say in our 21st century context that the only way that freedom, as you and I understand it, is not just going to survive but to flourish, is for us to reject the false promises of socialism. And the best way to recognize that all of the promises of socialism, and especially of communism and Marxism, are false, is to read history. I've mentioned to students, even through Socratic discussion, always welcoming differences of opinion in my classroom over the years, find one example in history of a Marxist or semi-Marxist country that succeeded. And by success, I'm not talking about the size of the military, I'm not talking about even the size of the GDP. Those are not really the best measures of human flourishing. The best measures of human flourishing would be freedom.
The American Republic is the inspiration for everybody who loves freedom. The American people, are the finest people on the planet because their system, what they created, has given them the liberty to express the finest aspects of their character, to build great churches, to build great universities, fantastic businesses, to build an army that could liberate people all over the world, to have fantastic scientific achievements. All of these things because of the American Constitution, because of the brave and very intelligent founding fathers who created that document. But that document must be destroyed, and the character of the American people must be destroyed so that every dictator, every communist on the planet may prosper. That's the battle of our age. That's the real battle that's being fought right now. Will the Constitution be saved and America be saved and the world continue into prosperity, or will the Constitution be destroyed, the American people enslaved, and the world plunged into darkness? That is the question. Well, America has, by example alone, has increased the liberty all over the world. America is the yardstick by which people measure the freedom in their own country. And they think, if only we could be more like America, if only our government was more like America, think of how free and prosperous we should be. So if that yardstick disappears, that is the aspiration of everybody. It's gone. There is nothing to measure things by. There's no country to point to and say, look, they do it so much better over there. That's what we need to do here. Well, if that is lost and it is erased from history, which it will be erased from history, America will be, the only mention of America in any history books will be this horrible, racist, slave-owning country that oppressed the world and did so much damage. That'll be America's legacy in the history books if we lose this republic. So if we lose that shining city on the hill, if we lose that great example, freedom will be lost everywhere. There'll be nothing for people to aspire to, no example and no protector. If America is lost, we lose that example, but we also lose that protector. and the bad guys of the world are unleashed. That's why we see an invasion of the Ukraine as imminent. That's why we see possible war in the Middle East breaking out with Iran very soon. That's why we see China expanding in the South China Sea, threatening Taiwan, because the balance of power has been upset. And if we lose America, we lose that, we lose the political protection, but we lose the political example. And that bodes horribly for freedom everywhere.
You can't have freedom of speech without having to sometimes endure speech you don't like to hear. You can't have freedom of belief without sometimes having to face beliefs you don't agree with. The same applies to the other freedoms we're given. And the greater tragedy of human history is what happens when we try to regulate away the freedoms we dislike, as this has always led to tyranny. When writers like George Orwell have imagined societies under complete tyranny, they've taken the form of dull and lifeless societies, where the diversity of belief, opinion, and choice are eliminated. Yes, freedom is sometimes chaotic, and also comes with its own dangers, but it's the challenges in life that allow for moral choice, and it's these difficulties that forge our characters. Happiness in classical education, going back to the days of Aristotle, was understood as being synonymous with virtue. Happiness does not come from eliminating hardships, but to instead learn to not be moved by hardships. It's for this reason that strong and good men allow for some discomforts to exist. Yet when faced with the all-encompassing tyranny that socialism brings, especially in times when it appears there's no path of recourse, what hope is there? We can look back again at our past, at the path forged by our founding fathers and the good men of history, when they were living under the tyranny of a regime that was stripping away their rights of speech and belief, denying them fair trial, subjecting them to illegal searches and seizures. They knew they were facing inconceivable odds. Their paths of recourse through the government and through the courts were denied to them. And so instead they went one level higher, and George Washington and others appealed to heaven. They hung flags in their ships stating plainly, an appeal to heaven. It's in times of hopelessness that the human spirit shows its mettle, and that faith shines its brightest. To have faith like that's stated in the Bible, that even as I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. Because where faith lives, goodness will always endure.